Hello and welcome. I'm Professor Khalid Khan from the University of Granada in Spain. Today, we will talk about how to get past the first hurdle in the publication process. An editor may reject a paper without sending it to peer review, and the author's objective is to convince the editor that this should not be the case. I'm going to give you an outline of how to achieve this. What has my own experience got to do with this? Well, after completing medical school and undertaking some residency experience in Africa in 1988, I started some work which ultimately got published in 1990. From this time onwards, as I became more skeptical about the effectiveness of interventions offered by doctors to patients, I took the opportunity to learn about clinical epidemiology at McMaster University in Canada. From there, I moved to the UK, and during my 25 years of working there as a clinical academic, I had the privilege of editing various journals, including as chief editor, the BJOG. And on moving to Spain during last 5 years, I've continued my role as a peer reviewer and as an editor. I've also published over 600 papers and recently these two books, one on systematic review and other on clinical trials. In the academic world, we live under the pressure to publish or perish. So stay with me, support me throughout this video so that I can give you some tips and tricks on how to avoid rejection by the editor without peer review. Well, as a metaphor, it's not bad to think of the publication process as a hurdle race. There are various hurdles, as you see on the slide here. And today, what we are talking about is how to get over the first hurdle. So let's see, as we take a jump over the first hurdle, we are faced with the editor who can reject the paper outright. In fact, in journals that have high rejection rates, frequently this is the case because they don't want themselves to engage in detailed assessments, ultimately only to reject the paper. But at the same time, they also don't want to waste authors' time in going through tedious revisions in the end when the chance of being accepted by themselves is low. So the editor makes this judgment quickly so that within days they might tell you that they are not going to send this paper out for peer review and you're best off elsewhere. The situation is not that different from what we see here in this race. If you cannot get past the first hurdle, there is no chance that you can get accepted and published in this journal. You will have to wait for another race, another time, in another journal. The journals normally give you a structure for writing your paper. It is called IMRAD. But before this structure can come into action, you have title and abstract. And don't forget, the title and abstract is read first before the introduction is read. And then maybe the methods, results, and discussion could be read. But in the end, if you don't pass through the title, abstract, and introduction, it is unlikely that the rest of what you write in your manuscript will ever be read. I say this um, not with tongue in cheek, but I say this from experience. Really, only a few of the co authors read the entire paper. Uh, Virtually none of the peer reviewers read the entire paper. And the editors who make the decision to reject the paper out of hand almost never read the entire paper. They make their decision quickly based on title, abstract, and introduction. And if that decision is to reject, then the paper does not go for peer review. So the moral of the story here is that the first impression matters because it has the power to get you past the post. At that stage, following peer review and revision, your paper may be accepted. So let's look at how you make this first impression in a manner that is convincing. To begin with comes the title. This has got to include as many components as possible of the structured research question. The second part of the title typically contains information about the design, and the first part of the title should contain the intervention or exposure with outcome, and if word count permits, then also information about participants. Then you have an abstract which should be structured. And the key thing here is that its objective and design should match the objective and design presented in the title. Then you will obviously present in brief the information about methodology and the results. And at this point, the editor will become interested in what is the importance of your topic. And this they want to decipher from your introduction. We will come back to this in a moment. But the third paragraph of introduction, or the last few lines before the method section of the main manuscript begins, you've got the objective and design again. Here, the editor is looking for coherence between what is presented in the title, what is in the objective and design of the abstract, and does all of this match with the objective and design presented in the introduction. Authors have a tendency to attempt to paraphrase between abstract and introduction. And this may lead to some changes and differences. And these differences may not be subtle, they may be substantial when it comes to describing the objective in two places about the same study in the same paper. Such differences are not appreciated. So you've got to be very careful in ensuring that you don't have inconsistency in various components of this research question presented in the title, the objective in the abstract, and the objective in the introduction. So from here on, we move to the introduction. Typically, the first page will contain the title, the second page of the manuscript will contain the abstract, and the third page, or the fourth page, if the abstract runs over into the third page, will be the introduction. These are the things that will be read first before anything else will be considered. So the key thing to keep in mind about introduction is that it is not a textbook chapter. It is not presenting material for a graduate student at university level. You've got to address an experienced clinician, academic clinician, or a scientist in your field. Here in the first paragraph, you've got to demonstrate the importance of the topic. You've got to demonstrate it via describing the prevalence, the life quality impact of the condition, the economic cost to the health system, and also the priority to the patients. You have only no more than 10 or 12 lines to describe all this. So consider 1 to 2 sentences per item. So you have 8 sentences, and consider 1 to 2 references per sentence. So you have no more than 8 or 10 references here. Here, now, what kind of references you can use? I propose that you use authoritative reports like those produced by the World Bank or the World Health Organization, but also you can see references from systematic reviews and meta-analysis. Indeed, much prevalence data is put together in systematic reviews by others. So use those as references to demonstrate the high burden of disease that can be expressed via prevalence data. Where prevalence is low, you can express the burden of disease through the impact of the condition on life quality of the sufferers and their carers, as well as the economic cost related to the disease. Indeed, some patient priority work may have been done by yourself earlier, and you can cite that work here. So, via this brief overview with strong references, you establish the importance of your topic. This will be in comparison to other topics being considered at the same time by the editor, depending on who else has submitted a paper around the same time as your submission. The next thing will be, why did you carry out the study? Well, perhaps you were advised by your senior colleagues or your supervisor if you are a doctoral or master student. But you can't really write here that the justification for my work is that I received direction or guidance from my supervisor. It's got to be more than the wish or preference of your supervisor that drive your work. The most important thing that you can do is to demonstrate that your type of study has never been done before. But I guarantee you that your inability to find a similar paper will probably be a reflection of a poor search conducted rather than the reality. Because in this day and age, it is very, very likely that the same idea emerges to other researchers in other geographical areas, in other universities who speak other languages, possibly even publish in other languages. So you got to search hard to look for papers of the kind that you are reporting in this paper. If that search is extensive, use the appendix section of the manuscript to describe that search. Simply saying, to our knowledge, no such study exists, just does not work. The editor does not have an interest in your personal knowledge or in the collective knowledge of your co authors. The editor has an interest in objective information, not subjective experience. Now, as I said, it's very likely that you will find some other papers like your own. In this case, you got to demonstrate that the existing papers are of poor quality. How can you demonstrate that? Keep in also keep in mind also that that the authors of the existing papers are very likely going to be your peer reviewers. They might even be one of the editors who may be reading your paper or for its first assessment. You demonstrate the weaknesses or deficiencies of previous papers in two ways. One, by evaluating them objectively through use of a critical appraisal checklist. For example, if your paper is a systematic review and previous reviews exist on the topic, you can simply apply the M-STAR checklist. And in areas where you find deficiencies, you can just report them in the second paragraph. Don't forget to, to describe clearly that your description of deficiencies emerges from application of the M-STAR checklist or another checklist in the case of a paper with another design. Now, it is almost impossible that there can be a previous publication without the editor requesting the author to give some limitations of their own work. So existing papers will contain the limitations of those papers in its discussion section. You can just pick up those limitations as described by those authors and provide them with reference in your second paragraph. And this way you can justify the need for your study. Now, if you can't justify the need for your study in light of deficiencies in the previous studies, then what justification is left to do a new study? Well, here you can make the argument that there is a need for replication. The need for replication, too, isn't just a question of personal preference. You've got to demonstrate why replication is required. And one example could be that a study may have been carried out in a developed country setting, and if you hail from a low income country setting, then you might say that since the health systems differ in the two settings, perhaps the intervention will not work in the same way. Perhaps it will not be accepted by the population. Perhaps it will not receive the same level of compliance. In this situation, you may have a justification for conducting a new study in your setting. So make this justification clear as the background to the need for replicating your work. So here we are. To summarize, the editor is the one who will make the first decision about whether or not your paper will have the benefit of seeking peer review or it will be rejected outright. Typically, this decision will be made quickly and will probably not need the consideration of much more than reading the title, abstract, and introduction of your paper. The editorial initial decision will be quick, it will be made under time pressure. The editor will not really have the time to go through the discussion to make this first assessment. The place for evaluating the discussion comes at a time when a decision has been made that the paper will likely be accepted. So at that time, the editor and peer reviewer can focus their attention on improving the discussion section, but not at this time, at the first hurdle. This consideration is not relevant. The most important thing is that what you have presented is coherent. And this can be easily tested by examining whether the objective, as covered in the abstract and the last paragraph of the introduction, matches with the elements of the research question presented in the title. And then the first paragraph of the introduction gives the editor the relevance and importance of your topic. You have to write this keeping in mind that you are not giving information to an undergraduate student whose sole purpose of reading the article, or in his case or her case, the chapter in a book, is to pass an exam. In the case of a science article, the purpose of getting the article published in a journal for an editor is to ensure that their journal can win the impact factor race against other journals. So they are looking for more mature description of importance than that required for a graduate student. And here is where your selection of references and the focus on disease burden description, as described earlier in this presentation, is key. And then you've got to justify the, the, the need for undertaking the study at the time when you started this work. Perhaps this work was commenced several years before the manuscript was presented. So the relevant time for the justification will be that time point. And if new evidence has emerged since that time, you will have to consider the new information in light in light uh, of its findings. And the way to deal with that is through looking at its own limitations as reported, plus also your appraisal of the previous papers using a critical appraisal checklist. Finally, if you don't find weaknesses in previous studies, then the remaining justification is the need for replication, which itself ought to be justified in your introduction. So with this, I hope you now have a clear idea as to how you can present a convincing case to an editor that your paper merits a peer review. And this is where you can get the cycle moving towards the process of acceptance. Thank you.